Michael Rothberg, and on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to this lecture by Professor Max Silverman of the University of Leeds. This lecture is part of the 1939 Society program in Holocaust Studies and is also offered in conjunction with the cluster course on political violence in the modern world, which I co-teach together with Professor Leah Rosgal, along with Jared McBride and recontextualising, and a great collection of teaching assistants. Today's lecture is also generously co-sponsored by the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. We thank you for joining us today and ask that you please take a moment to silence your cell phone. This is the first in-person public lecture that I have been part of in exactly 2 years. And after dozens of Zoom events, I can't think of anyone I'd rather introduce than Max Silverman, whom I've known as a friend and colleague for about 15 years. Max is professor of modern French studies at the University of Leeds and has been a path-breaking scholar of post-colonial and critical race studies in the French and Francophone spheres for decades. And he also became a leading figure in Holocaust, genocide, and memory studies over the past decade or two as well. I see three major overlapping phases in Max's scholarship, starting with a first phase focused on questions of race. His first book was Deconstructing the Nation, Immigration, Racism, and Citizenship in Modern France, which was published by Routledge in 1992 and translated into German 2 years later. Other important contributions to the thinking of race include his two edited collections, Race, Discourse, and Power in France from 1991, and France Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks from 2005, a rich collection of essays on that key text. At the time I met Max, he was in the middle of a second phase of scholarship and was at work on a project on the intersections of post-colonial and post-Holocaust literature, cinema, theory, and memory. And we worked together, along with Debarty Sanyal of Berkeley, on a special double issue of Yale French Studies, which we called Nœuds de Mémoire, Knots of Memory, a pun on Pierre Nora's Lieux de Mémoire, which brought together leading scholars of French and Francophone studies to explore the knotted intersections, as Paul Gilroy called them, of colonialism and the Holocaust. Max's own important book on this subject came out in 2013 from Berghahn, Palimpsestic Memory, The Holocaust and Colonialism in French and Francophone Fiction and Film. Max's theory of palimpsestic memory brings out the layerings and hauntings that mnemonic texts can get, which he finds exemplified in a wide range of works by such diverse figures as Cixous and Derrida, Assia Djebar and Patrick Chamoiseau, Jean-Luc Godard, and Georges Perec. Even as he was at work on palimpsestic memory, Max had already embarked on a new project, which I think constitutes a third phase of his career, a major collaboration with the feminist art historian Griselda Pollock. Funded with a large grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council during the years 2007 through 2011, Concentrationary Memories and the Politics of Representation involved various conferences and special events and led to no less than 4 edited collections, the latest of which is Concentrationary Art, published in 2019. Earlier publications include Concentrationary Imaginaries from 2015 and Concentrationary Memories from 2014. My favorite of this series is Concentrationary Cinema, dedicated to aesthetics as political resistance in Alain René's Night and Fog, as the subtitle puts it. This is the definitive volume on René's film, arguably one of the most important of the 20th century. And the volume won a prestigious award from the Krasna Kraus Foundation, which, if I remember correctly, involved an event with a red carpet. This third phase of Max's work sought to develop an approach to what David Rousset called the concentrationary universe, a construction overlapping with but distinct from what we usually think about as the Holocaust. I believe we may see aspects of this project that Max developed with Griselda Pollock in today's lecture. So Max's lecture this afternoon addresses a key work in Holocaust studies by a former colleague of Max's at Leeds. It is titled Thinking in Dark Times, Zygmunt Bauman's Modernity and the Holocaust and the Art of the Invisible. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Max Silverman.
Well, it's funny hearing your career summed up in a particular way that you hadn't necessarily thought of yourself. But that was nice. So thank you very much, Michael, for that generous introduction. Thank you too for the invitation to come here to speak to you today. Not only from Michael, but also from Leve and also Sarah Steen, the director of the Centre for Jewish Studies here. So thank you all for this invitation. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I will operate that, hopefully, as we go through. And this is the first time that I've actually spoken through a mask. I can already feel the mask slipping. So I'm going to try and keep it on. And I hope that you can hear me and that my voice isn't going to be too muffled as I speak. That's the title of my talk, Thinking in Dark Times, Zygmunt Bauman's Modernity and the Holocaust, 30 years on, and the Art of the Invisible. A few weeks ago, Whoopi Goldberg was criticised for saying that the Holocaust wasn't about race. I'm sure you all remember, it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't about race, as it involved two groups of white people. What it was really about, she said, was man's inhumanity to man. Her quote. Now, I don't want to, my talk is not going to be about the rights and wrongs of this controversy, mostly the wrongs, concerning, I think, misguided ideas about race and racism. But I hope that my talk will shed a different light on Goldberg's confusion between the racial genocide of the Jews, known as the Holocaust, and what she calls man's inhumanity to man. And first, I want to return to a book about the Holocaust that appeared just over 30 years ago, in 1989, called Modernity and the Holocaust. As I'm sure a number of you will know, it's by the Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. Bauman had to leave Poland in 1968 as a dissident intellectual at the time of communist rule, and also due to a new wave of anti-Semitism in the country. After 3 years in Israel, he came to Leeds in 1971 to take up the chair of sociology at the University of Leeds, and stayed in Leeds until he died in 2017. After Modernity and the Holocaust, Bauman's international reputation was consolidated through numerous works on post-modernity, or what he subsequently termed liquid modernity. At the time of its publication in 1989, Modernity and the Holocaust stood out from the prevailing scholarship on the Holocaust by rejecting many of the existing arguments and paradigms about the Holocaust. For example, arguments about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, about the nature of absolute evil, about the opposition between civilisation and barbarity, about the history of anti-Semitism, and the so-called German problem, and what Theodor Adorno defined as the authoritarian personality. So this book did not fit any of those paradigms, and therefore stood out as something different sort of approach to the Holocaust, to an analysis of the Holocaust. Instead, Bauman contextualized the Holocaust within the rationalizing, bureaucratic and technocratic structures of modernity and their effects on our moral compass. For Bauman, the Holocaust was a product of modern social engineering carried out by a gardening state whose mission was to eradicate the weeds of ambivalence. and another of his books was called Modernity and Deliverance. Modern processes have distanced us from the moral consequences of our actions and allow for horrific outcomes, not necessarily from evil intent, but from mundane actions as part of the rationalizing and bureaucratic machine of modernity. By pointing up the connections between genocide and modernity, the book reconnected with Frankfurt School critiques of the Enlightenment, with Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil, and with post-war analyses of the normalized, invisible, and systemic forms of racism and violence in capitalism in the West. But just as Bauman recontextualized the Holocaust within modernity, what I would like to do is to recontextualize the book itself. In the first part of this talk, I will argue that Holocaust studies and genocide studies are perhaps not the most appropriate places to situate the work, as despite its title, Modernity and the Holocaust is not primarily about the Holocaust. I will suggest that in reconnecting with Frankfurt School critiques of the Enlightenment, Modernity and the Holocaust is a response to the atrocities of the Second World War that focuses not on the racial genocide of the Jews that came to be known as the Holocaust, but on a different, though overlapping history concerning the assault on the human qua human that in France became known as the concentrationary universe, and that Hannah Arendt also explored in her major work, Origins of Totalitarianism. And Michael has already touched on this distinction that I'm going to be referring to between the Holocaust and the concentrationary universe. In the second part of the talk, I will go on to argue that Bauman's reading of the hidden violence at the heart of modern societies is not only a hermeneutic sociological reading of modernity, but also connects with art forms that reveal the invisible in the visible and open up a space for the possible. I'll characterize this double reading of the everyday as concentrationary art rather than Holocaust art, and suggest that today, when what Hannah Arendt defined as the human condition is under attack in numerous, often invisible ways, this form of reading and this art are important weapons in the struggle for a human life. Actually, what I've got there on that slide, no, it's in fact on the next slide, so, are the four parts of my talk: concentrationary universe, concentrationary art, a film called World of Glory, and then talking about modernity and violence. So, first of all, let me clarify what I mean when I say that modernity and the Holocaust is not primarily about the Holocaust, but is rather a concentrationary work. French critics, Sylvie Lindeperg, Annette Vieviorca, and Catherine Cocchio, among others, have shown how two parallel but often intersecting histories emerge about the atrocities of the Second World War. On the one hand, the history of what David Rousset, returning political deportee from Buchenwald, termed the concentrational universe in his 1946 book of the same name. And on the other, the history of the genocide of the Jews that would later be known as the Holocaust or Shoah in France. Lindeperg and Vieviorca outline the uneven cycle of the recording of these two histories to show how the commemoration of the experience of the political deportee, the major victim of the concentration universe, in the early post-war years, gave way from the filmed trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961 to an emphasis on the figure of the racial deportee, the Jew, as the major victim of genocide, heralding what Vieviorca called the era of Uniqueness, Leve du which was her 1998 book of the same name. The distinction between these two histories raises the following question. What exactly is the object of our analysis when we're seeking to understand the atrocities of the Second World War? Is it genocide, which largely, though by no means exclusively, took place in extermination camps? Or is it the process of dehumanization and the evisceration of the political sphere that was a product of the political-industrial complex of the concentration universe, whose most egregious site was the concentration camp? In fact, very few Jews actually died in concentration camps, which is probably a fact that is known to specialists but not known to many others. The distinction between the concentrationary universe and the racial genocide, that is, between the concentrationary and the exterminatory, was a crucial point for a research project that Michael already mentioned, that my colleague Griselda Pollock and I carried out over a number of years, entitled Concentrationary Memories and the Politics of Representation. Our purpose was to bring to an English-speaking audience for whom the Holocaust had become the major lens through which to approach the atrocities of the war, an understanding of the history of the concentration camp, not really very well known in the English-speaking world, though certainly in the French-speaking world. This history, then, that was developed in France in the post-war period by David Rousset and others, other French political returnees from the camps. Our project certainly did not seek to downplay the significance of the attempted racial genocide of Jews, or suggest that the duty of memory relating to the Shoah is not an ongoing duty for us all. It was to suggest, however, that we needed to disentangle certain aspects of the catastrophic histories of the 20th century that had been folded into the Holocaust in order to identify a politics, or in Hannah Arendt's terms, an anti-politics, of total domination and its systematic destruction of the human that was distinct from the genocide of the Jews. In the introduction to the first of our 4 books on the theme of the concentrationary cinema, Griselda Pollock and I suggested that the affinities between Bauman's Modernity and Holocaust and the ideas of the concentrationary thinkers like Rousset make it more appropriate to situate this work within a concentrationary rather than Holocaust historiography, while recognizing that these two histories are not distinct and separate, but are often connected and overlapping. And there are confusions, not only interconnections, but confusions between the two, not the least of which is the title of the book itself. If it really is a book that suggests one thing, but actually, when you read it, is possibly about something rather different. And it could be that it's this confusion that in part underpins Whoopi Goldberg's unfortunate statement. The risk of confusion is understandable as genocide emerges within the broader assault on the human. The distinction, however, I would maintain, is important if we're to specify the principal object of analysis in Modernity and the Holocaust, and to identify its particular approach to extreme violence. What then are the defining characteristics of Rousset's thesis that allow us to reinterpret this book, Modernity and the Holocaust, as a concentrationary rather than Holocaust work? Rousset's book, The Concentrationary Universe, acts as a warning to normal men and women that now, following the events of Nazi totalitarianism, everything is possible. a statement which Hannah Arendt quotes repeatedly in Origins of Totalitarianism. Tout est possible is the original quote. Rousset exhorts us to integrate this knowledge into our understanding of the human, however unbelievable it might appear in the light of what we thought about the West's march towards progress and civilization. For once unleashed on the world, and despite the defeat of its Nazi incarnation, the concentrationary universe will reappear unless we are permanently vigilant. Rousset's call for a new understanding of the relationship between the normal and the unimaginable is therefore premised on the belief that the concentrationary universe is profoundly connected to the world outside the camps, rather than a barbaric retreat from civilized life. As he says at the end of his essay, and I quote, "Germany interpreted with an originality in keeping with her history the crisis that led her to the concentration university. But the existence and the mechanism of that crisis were inherent in the economic and social foundations of capitalism and imperialism." Defined in this way, then, the concentrationary refers not only to the Nazi camps themselves, but to a whole process of systematic dehumanization, of which, as Hannah Arendt said, the concentration, and I quote, "the concentration camps are the most consequential institution," end of quote. Thus, the concentrationary did not disappear with the liberation of the camps and the defeat of Nazism, but permeates post-war normal life in invisible ways. A crucial aspect of the works of both Rousset and Arendt is their attempt to defamiliarize the banality of the everyday and the normal, to show the persistence of unimaginable horror and a radical reshaping of the idea of the human in post-war life. Hence, to appeal to our slumbering consciousness by exposing the hidden potential of violence in the everyday and the overlap between supposedly different worlds. Modernity and the Holocaust strikes a very similar chord, I would suggest, to this approach. It's precisely in the tension between the horror and the everyday, the normal and the extreme, and the exhortation to see one in the other, rather than one distinct from the other, that the book is at its most powerful. Bauman, too, warns against complacency, especially on the part of sociologists and other academics who have failed to see the what he calls the unanticipated consequences of Max Weber's diagnoses of modern society. In this respect, Bauman's approach is in keeping with the way in which the term the concentrationary came to be used in the post-war period in France, to describe not simply the world of the camps, but more generally the dehumanizing process of rationalizing modernity and commodity capitalism. Urban sociologists, social psychologists, linguists, cultural critics and others dissected the everyday, and the tradition of the everyday in France is a major tradition of analysis of the everyday, although there are clearly links with a Gramscian analysis of common sense as well. So, for example, in terms of this take-up in the post-war critical world of this idea of the concentrationary as a broad idea, the major French theorist of everyday life, Henri Lefebvre, stated in the top quote there, I think, yes, The concentration camp is the most extreme and paroxysmal form of a modern housing estate or of an industrial town. In his famous 1949 article on the mirror phase, psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan uses the term concentrationary to define the way in which social relations have been subsumed within and consequently disfigured by a utilitarian ethos. The philosophers Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lefort define extreme forms of bureaucratization in concentrationary terms in the first issue of the journal Socialisme ou Barbarie. The situationist Guy Debord similarly defines the systemic nature of the commodification of human relations in modern capitalist society in concentrationary terms. While in his comments, against urbanism, his fellow situationist, Raoul Vaneigem, echoing Lefebvre in the second quote here, wrote the immortal line, "If the Nazis had known contemporary urbanists, they would have transformed their concentration camps into low-income housing." As one critic has said in the next quote, "The camp is therefore no longer confined within the field of the analysis of totalitarian societies, but functions as a prism of analysis of phenomena which are, more broadly speaking, political, sociological, economic, and also linguistic." End of quote. And more recently, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben has returned to this critique of modernity in his theorization of the camp. Quote, "Not as a historical fact, an anomaly belonging to the past, but in some way as the hidden matrix and nomos of the political space in which we're still living." And of course there's been lots of criticism of his approach, and I'll return briefly to it later. I suggest then that Bauman's critique of existing scholarship on the Holocaust and his focus on the rationalization, bureaucratization, objectification and demoralization of human relations in modern capitalism is an implicit acknowledgement of the concentrationary system, even if Bauman doesn't make this reference explicit himself. Excuse me. I'm going to move on to the second section about concentrationary art and reading the warning signs. I'm arguing then that modernity and the Holocaust shares with the French theorists of the concentrationary universe the diagnosis of the invisible, violent, and dehumanizing underside of modernity. But this is because they share a method for reading the invisible violence of the normal world, of perceiving the unimaginable in the banal, or as Bauman says, of decoding the warning signs. Bauman proclaims in Arendtian terms, the unimaginable ought to be imagined. In Modernity and the Holocaust, he advocates a hermeneutic sociology that can, indeed must, imagine the unimaginable, comprehend everyday life in terms of the potentiality of extreme forms of violence, and see the latency of violence within normalized, ordered, and civilized society. As he observes in the final quote here, violence has been taken out of sight rather than forced out of existence. It has become invisible. The disappearance of violence from the horizon of daily life is thus one more manifestation of the centralizing and monopolizing tendencies of modern power. Violence is absent from individual intercourse because it is now controlled by forces definitely outside the individual reach. And as a way of reading hidden violence in the everyday, the parallel with the concentrationary that I wish to make is with the work of another French political deportee to the camps, Jean Quérol, and his concept of what he called concentrationary or Lazarean art. Quérol was a published poet before joining the resistance in 1941. In March 1943, he was arrested and deported to the notorious Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria under the infamous Nacht und Nebel, Night and Fog decree designed to make political resistance to Nazism disappear into the night and fog. It's his experience at Mauthausen that forms the basis for his concept of the survivor as a revenant from a state of death, and is at the heart of his ideas of concentrational art. For Quérol, crucially, the new art would not, and this is perhaps one of my major points, to distinguish not only the concentrationary from the exterminatory and concentrational universe from what we know as the Holocaust, but also trying to distinguish as well two different art forms which accompany each of these. Again, just not to suggest that these are two distinct art forms, because there are many overlaps and interconnections, but nevertheless it might be important to actually make the distinction, because for Quérol, crucially, this is someone who had been an inmate himself in one of the concentration camps, one of the worst concentration camps, and survived. His idea of art is not based on testimony. It's not testimonial art form. Wouldn't be about testimony of survivors of the camps, like him, like Rousset. Rather, it is an art which can depict the normal, everyday world as one that bears the imprint of what happened in the camps and is therefore haunted by terror and death, like Lazarus, who has known death and bears its mark on his return to the land of the living. The task then is to defamiliarize the everyday, to reveal latent violence, and to read horror in conjunction with the normal, not as its opposite. Quérol wrote the spoken narrative for the film that Michael mentioned before, Anna Renet's classic film on the camps, We Are Night and Fog, made in 1955. And those of you who know that film, and I'm sure many of you do, will remember that in the unforgettable opening sequence, the camera slides effortlessly from the fields surrounding Auschwitz across the barbed wire to the interior of the camp, while the narrator intones dispassionately, even a peaceful countryside can lead quite simply to a concentration camp. Following this shocking image of the proximity of horror the other day, the same message is delivered in this film in different ways. Concentration camps are shown to come in all sorts of commonplace architectural styles and contain many of the attributes of ordinary life, even resembling towns. The familiar appearance of objects is simply a deceptive decor, hiding something more sinister. Torture is carried out in what appear to be hospitals, gas chambers, masquerades, showers. The new executioners do not have a different face to our own, and the post-war landscape of renewed normality is haunted by the millions of dead. The final sequence, the narrator implores us to open our eyes. We who fool ourselves into believing that all that happened in one country, and who do not think to look around us, and who fail to hear the endless cry, will never be able to identify the concentrationary plague still with us. Enlightenment film does show atrocity images. It does use archive footage. It's not simply based in the present. But the previous examples that I just mentioned very briefly tell us of a different message. A different message that I think we need to take from the film, rather than the ones that deal with archive footage and the atrocity images, which weren't chosen by Kehol anyway, they were chosen by Hannah Arendt. They tell of a different message about extreme violence, underpinning Kehol's concept of concentrationary art. An art, that is, that deals not with visible representations of violence, but rather the everyday as a haunted space. An art that can read the hidden signs of violence in order to counter their subtle deformation of the human. That's and in his 1950 work, Lazare parmi nous, Lazarus amongst us, or among us, Kehol describes this in terms of a dual reality, in which an invisible thread ties the human to the inhuman. The new art will therefore depict this other reality beneath the everyday, not in a direct way, not explicitly. And this is why I'm talking about the art of the invisible, because I believe this sort of art is not an art of the visible. It actually shuns, it actually eschews the visible. This isn't a direct way of depicting violence. It's allusive, it's oblique, it's not explicit. In his 1964 postface to Kehol's 1959 novel Les Causes étrangères, Foreign Bodies, Roland Barthes talks of the way Kehol's art never names the camps or the concentration plague explicitly, but conjures them up allusively as a sort of existential malaise inhabiting everyday life. And Barthes says this: Kehol's novels are the very passage from the concentrationary event to the concentrationary everyday. In them we discover today, 20 years after the camps, a certain form of human malaise, a certain quality of atrocity, of the grotesque, of the absurd. End of quote. Bauman's hermeneutic reading of atrocity in everyday life also shuns the explicit, and is founded on a similar double vision to that proposed by Kehol. And this is Bauman from Modernity and the Holocaust. We associate dehumanization with horrifying pictures of the inmates of concentration camps, humiliated by reducing their action to the most basic level of primitive survival, by depriving them even of recognizable likeness, recognizable human likeness. Sorry. These pictures, however, represent only an extreme manifestation of a tendency which may be discovered in all bureaucracies, however benign and innocuous the tasks in which they are currently engaged. I suggest that the discussion of the dehumanizing tendency, rather than being focused on in its most sensational and vile, but fortunately uncommon manifestations, ought to concentrate on the more universal, and for this reason potentially more dangerous manifestations. End of quote. In Bauman's eyes, this is the crucial point about violence. It is also at the heart of Kehol's concentrationary art. Not, I repeat, its explicit manifestations and its possible spectacularization and representation, but its invisible presence. If I may, I want to just talk briefly about a film, which I don't suppose many of you will know, but do tell me if you do. It's a short film by a Swedish filmmaker, Roy Andersson, called World of Glory. Has anyone ever seen this film? It's only 15 minutes, 20 minutes. It's short. Made in 1991. Roy Anderson is an absolutely fascinating filmmaker. So I do recommend, I do suggest that you have a look at some of his films. This film, World of Glory, is, I think, a fascinating example of concentrationary art, and also accompaniment to modernity and the Holocaust. It was released in 1991, only 2 years after Bauman's book, but it shares with that book the uncanny depiction of horror and the everyday. It starts with a shocking image of smartly dressed bystanders watching naked men, women and children being shoved into a lorry by similarly smartly dressed officials, a pipe conveying presumably lethal gas being attached to the lorry, and the departure of the lorry to the accompaniment of screams from within. One of the bystanders, a middle-aged man who remains nameless throughout the film, watches with his back to camera and occasionally, as here, looks back over his shoulder to face the camera. The shocking image of the gas vans, the precursors to the industrialised slaughter of the gas chambers, is made even more shocking in this depiction by the apparent banality of the scene, the unremarkable and besuited appearance of the officials, who have no weapons to coerce their victims into the lorry, and the passivity of the bystanders. None of the 14 other, this film is made up of 15 sequences. This is the first sequence. There were 14 other sequences that make up this very short film. But none of the 14 other sequences that make up the rest of the film refer back explicitly to this scene, or deal in any direct way with the Holocaust. They show this middle-aged man, the one who you can see turning round here, in the most ordinary of settings, and often holding his briefcase. Standing by his car, in an office here with his brother, standing in a corridor, having his hair cut, seated in a shoe shop, in the bath, sitting on his bed, and with members of his family at significant moments, with his mother in hospital, at the grave of his father, holding his son while a doctor performs a minor operation on the son's head. Yet, just as Kehol's concentrationary art deals neither with the camps themselves, nor the testimonies of survivors, but rather with the invisible imprint of the concentrationary universe on post-war everyday life, so the 14 sequences of banal actions bear the invisible imprint of the shocking opening sequence. The man whose story is recounted in these brief tableaux is a Lazarean figure whose life is shadowed by death and whose apparent normality hides the grotesque, the absurd, and the horrific. And it's for these reasons that I would classify this film, like Nightfall and Modernity and the Holocaust, as concentrationary works, not works about the Holocaust, despite the opening sequence of this film, just as Night and Fog, despite the parts of that film which do deal with genocide in the gas chambers. And like them, Anderson's film is concerned with a way of reading the everyday for the hidden signs of violence. In the opening sequence, the man twice turns to the camera to align the gaze of the spectator with the gaze of the bystander and make us, comfortable spectators, cocooned in our safe world of normality, complicit with this scene of atrocity. In a later sequence, the man is dragged out from under a table in a restaurant shouting, "I can't see!" And in the final sequence, seated on the end of his bed, with his wife behind him, his hands clasping his ears, he shouts desperately, mimicking the famous painting by Edvard Munch, and possibly also the endless cry at the end of Night of the Frog. "Isn't someone screaming?" he shouts out. There's actually nothing to be heard apart from him saying the words, "Isn't someone screaming?" Seeing and not seeing, hearing and not hearing, run through the film as warnings to open our eyes and ears to what is taking place beneath the surface of everyday life and resist the terrible illusion of normality. And my final section, then, if I may, is just a few reflections on modernity and violence as they pertain to Zygmunt Bauman's approach here in Modernity and Holocaust. So, if this is about the concentrationary universe, not the Holocaust, and proposes a similar way of reading the hidden violence in the modern world to that advocated by Jean Queiroz in his concept of concentrationary art, it offers us as well a particular way of understanding the nature and scope of modern violence. First, if the book deals more with the concentration universe rather than genocide, then it means that we must consider any case of violence beyond the specific time and place of the event itself. As I mentioned earlier on, the concentrationary is dependent on seeing the camps not as distinct from their surrounding context or surrounding moments, but as part of the landscape of modernity, rather than unique and singular. Of course, this approach runs the risk of seeing the concentrationary everywhere in contemporary life, and some of the criticisms of Agamben's view of the camp as the hidden matrix of modern society certainly runs that risk, and has continued to run that risk. Nevertheless, Bauman's approach suggests that the risk is even greater. There are two risks of extending, of conceiving of contemporary everyday life as concentrationary, as if there's no distinction. There's another risk, which is and possibly an even greater risk if we fail to comprehend the multiple connections and entanglements between the violence and dehumanization that take place in camps and the surrounding landscape of modernity. So there are certainly risks in each of those. Second, if modernity and the Holocaust, and certainly in this book, Bauman is very clear that he's not saying modernity is the Holocaust. He's not saying that at all. He's simply saying that it couldn't have happened without modern developments. Second, if modernity and the Holocaust reconnects with Rousset, David Rousset, with Hannah Arendt, who both show how the concentrationary is, in Rousset's words that I read out earlier, inherent in the economic and social foundations of capitalism and imperialism, then we should read its critique of modern violence in the same broad way as they do. Bauman's approach can therefore be said to prefigure, I would suggest, transnational analyses of the histories of violence, which challenge the idea of separate, comparative, and competitive histories, and the compartmentalization of metropolitan history, colonial history, and the history of European genocide. And I think that is implicit in, although Zygmunt Bauman is one critic who has very often been criticized for his approach to modernity, which doesn't actually account for colonialism as being a major part inherent to Western modernity. But there's a way of actually looking at this, I think, slightly differently, which is to suggest that this book does allow for ways of seeing modern violence, which can include colonialism and other forms of extreme violence as well. My third point is that Bauman's approach to violence unsettles the dichotomy between perpetrators and victims, which of course was very much a part of Michael's most recent book, The Implicated Subject. Bauman's understanding of the systemic nature of racism and violence, his critique of Adorno's thesis of the authoritarian personality, which exonerates all those who are not proto-Nazis, and the conclusions he draws from the experience of Milgram and Zimbardo, the Stanford prison experiment based on the findings of Stanley Milgram, the Yale psychologist, which I'm sure a lot of you know, regarding the connections between violence and normality, all suggest a far more nuanced picture of the oppositions between guilt and innocence and the question of complicity. The startling declaration in Night and Fog that the new executioners will not have a different face to our own is one that is implied throughout modernity and the Holocaust. And finally, thinking of violence beyond its visible signs entails the hermeneutics that reads latent violence in the everyday, and an art that is grounded in the everyday to reveal latent violence and open up the realm of the possible. Kehol's concentrationary art is influenced especially by Bertolt Brecht's Verfremdungseffekt, or alienation devices, for demystifying the normalized everyday, and also a surrealist defamiliarization, re-enchantment, and rehumanization of the everyday. Bauman's sociology of making the familiar strange also involves, if only indirectly, a blend of Freud's uncanny, surrealism, and Brecht, although none of these are actually mentioned explicitly in the text. I repeat then, though, that this is not an art of trauma, of testimony, and memory, or post-testimony and post-memory, for second and third generations. Post-testimony and post-memory for second and third generations. It's not an art of survivors. It's not an art of victims and camps that one normally associates with art and the Holocaust. And it very much comes out of that post-war tradition of analysis of the everyday, both within the context of modern forms of capitalism, commodity capitalism, and especially those theorists who are the major theorists of understanding and analysing the everyday in that post-war tradition, which of course, when art of the Holocaust moves into the era of the witness, Annette Yoka talks about, that tradition tends to get overridden, blurred, lost sight of to a certain extent, and a different way of conceiving art in relation to the Holocaust, I think, takes over. But I repeat, I'm not talking about two totally separate ways of actually trying to deal with representations of extreme violence, because quite clearly there are overlaps and connections. In a more general sense, modernity in the Holocaust adopts the logic of concentrationary art by beseeching us to to break with the binary thinking that prevents us from identifying forms of dehumanization in the most unlikely of places and imagining them as latent in the most common of practices. In the lecture Zygmunt Bauman gave on being awarded the prestigious Amalfi Prize in May 1990, which is reproduced in the 2000 edition of Modernity and the Holocaust, Bauman refers to what the Holocaust historian Saul Friedlander, formerly, of course, the holder of the chair in Holocaust studies here at UCLA, what Friedlander describes as historian's paralysis, which in Friedlander's words, in the first quote here, arises from the simultaneity and the interaction of entirely heterogeneous phenomena. Messianic fanaticism and bureaucratic structures, pathological impulses and administrative decrees, archaic attitudes within an advanced industrial society. End of quote. And the important Bauman quotes Friedlander. And the important lesson that Bauman takes from Friedlander's insight is to reverse the assumption of heterogeneous phenomena, to reverse that by saying in the second quote here, and I quote from Bauman, entangled in the net of marginalizing narratives we all help to weave, we fail to see what we stare at. The only thing we're able to note is the confusing heterogeneity of the picture, coexistence of things our language does not allow to coexist, the complicity of factors that, as our narratives tell us, belong to different epochs or different times. Their heterogeneity is not a finding, but an assumption. Only by reinterpreting heterogeneity as coexistence will we be able... I moved on. The last line of the quote is, it is this assumption where comprehension could appear in this form. End of quote. So it's only by reinterpreting heterogeneity as coexistence that we will be able to perceive what is hidden in plain sight. This is Bauman's sociological hermeneutic. Bauman always knew how to read forms of violence beneath the managed decor of and discourses of modernity and liquid modernity. Jacqueline Rose, amongst others, has recently updated this view with regard to recent forms of violence in the third quote here. It's a truism to say that everyone knows violence when they see it. But if one thing has become clear in the past decade, it's that the most prevalent, insidious forms of violence are those that cannot be seen. For Bauman, Rose and others, this is one of the many lessons learned from Hannah Arendt, who always knew how fragile democracy and the human are, and that their preservation is dependent on thinking in dark times. For Bauman, thinking in dark times becomes an even more urgent task as power becomes more divorced from politics in a world of globalized capital, culture and communications. And legal and institutional regulation has failed to keep up with the new reality. Thinking in dark times is essential if the new normal, which is a new normal, is to be brought into the realm of the political. We don't have the political structures, the political processes to actually deal with the new realities that we confront and that we live in. This is one of the major things that Zygmunt Bauman constantly used to say. And I do agree with him on that point. So thinking in dark times is an essential thing if we're to be able to bring the new normal into the realm of the political, if we are to challenge the ways in which everyday lives can be disfigured today, not only through extreme forms of violence, which of course we're seeing today, especially in Ukraine, but also elsewhere, but in the name of progress, in the name of freedom, in the name of choice, in the name of efficiency, and other admirable terms. And if we're to perceive the new ways in which democracy and the human can be eroded from within, I've suggested that bringing this Arendtian political thesis on thinking of dark times into dialogue with an art of the invisible, of the sort proposed by Gihle's concentrationary art, not only allows us to imagine the unimaginable, but also to comprehend the realm of the possible beyond normalized perception. Zygmunt Bauman's Modernity and the Holocaust is, I believe, in this spirit. I imagine it as inspired by a combination of, and these are all people who Bauman quotes, a combination of an awakening of the sort proposed by Walter Benjamin, a re-engagement with spontaneity and pluralism at the heart of Arendt's vision of the human condition, and an ethics of otherness that resists totalization that he takes from the philosopher Leve. Vigilance and resistance, or resistance through vigilance, were the bywords of the theorists of the concentrationary. Modernity and the Holocaust is, I think, a significant contribution to this tradition of critical thought and artistic practice.
Thank you, Max.
I've gone on too long.
But it was fascinating, and I've sort of forgotten how this works, but I think this is the part where we now have discussion and questions. And I know I have a lot of questions. We have some time for questions, but I want to also give a chance to the audience. So come forward with their comments. But I'll start with one of my own. And this is in a way, this is I mean it seriously, but it's the less serious of a series of questions I have, which is, you knew Zygmunt Bauman quite well up until the end of his life. I'm curious if you ever proposed to him this reading of Modernity and the Holocaust as, in fact, not actually about the Holocaust, but about something else, and whether how he did or how you think he might have responded to that thesis. And in fact, the title in some ways is misleading, we would say. Do you think that this is something that he would have actually agreed with?
I never mentioned it. I never mentioned it to Zygmunt. Anything that you mentioned to Zygmunt, he would probably dismiss out of hand anyway. Anyone who knew Zygmunt Bauman. Because you didn't actually have a conversation too much. He told you. He was such a prodigious reader. He was well aware of the traditions that he was drawing from. He was less aware, I think, of this tradition of the concentrationary. And so I would hope that he would have been interested in that. But given that this is a very Arendtian book, and the concentrationary tradition is itself a sort of Arendtian, well, in that Arendt herself took a lot from the political analyses of the survivors, especially Gary Rousset and others, in her own formulations. So there are certainly connections, and I'm assuming because of that, you might have been interested.
But you didn't dare to ask.
But in fact, we never get around to it.
Okay.
But I can say that in terms of the films and the books that he liked and that we did discuss, and one of which we're going to be talking about tomorrow, by Michael Haneke, which was one of his favourites as well. And so his whole approach to violence was in that way of seeking out the invisible, of what is less spectacular, less explicit. So in that sense, yes.
I was thinking so much about cachet, in fact, as you were speaking, because it really resonated with that notion of the invisible violence, especially. Anybody else?
I mean, thank you very much for such a fascinating talk, and such a substantive talk as well. I mean, the big point you were sort of underscoring in regards to Bauman about how the most sensational manifestations of violence can hide the less sensational that maybe in the end explain, give you the bigger picture of current life, the legacy, and even of what happened in the first place. I'm sure it has a lot of explanatory power, even if it's not, even if it doesn't explain everything. But my question is, and obviously, in the case of Zygmunt Bauman, I mean, you feel the commitment to Marxism that underlies, part of his own situation as someone who had fought with the Red Army to liberate Poland with a real commitment to social communism. And did that. I mean, you do feel vested with that. My question is, I mean, how would you address the Gulag, or how would you address, the Chinese re-education camps? Would we use a parallel argument, that is not distinct from, but part of, the Soviet experiment or the China? In other words, when you bring these into the equation, does that invite you to reaffirm or to reconsider aspects of Bauman's argument?
Thank you. Good question. Different parts to your question than the first about Marxism. Yeah, let's remember that, of course, he did fight with the Red Army as a young man at the time of the Second World War. But then, of course, he became a revisionist Marxist, and that was one of the reasons why he was a dissident and then portrayed as a spy and was forced to flee Poland. So his relationship with Marxism was not a straightforward one. And but the other thing that I want to say is that it is precisely that tradition that, yes, of course, there are in his later works. There is a Marxist tradition there in terms of analysis, but it's precisely that which, when one talks about an art of the Holocaust, in terms of the major ways in which, in the era of the witness, those art forms, and possibly especially when trauma becomes a major paradigm, trauma and the victim become major paradigms for, even sometimes unspoken paradigms, for understanding, shaping our approach. It's precisely a Marxist tradition. It's precisely different traditions which do get lost sight of. Now, which I think that making this distinction is a sort of a move in order to bring back into play a mode of analysis which isn't to do with trauma, victims, survivors, and the rest of it, and is actually bringing back the idea of processes which perhaps we tend to lose sight of in the era of the witness, or even the era of the post-witness. The second part of your question is about how we explain then various other forms of extreme violence. Well, I think the concentrationary actually gives us a handle on that in a way that the debates around the Holocaust, and especially debates around the uniqueness of the Holocaust, doesn't necessarily, or if it does, it's always in a comparative way. It's always through analogy. Analysing or comparing different genocides, invidious, can be a very invidious approach. So this isn't a comparative. I don't feel that this is a comparative approach, but it does allow one to conceive of different forms of violence that take place, not necessarily as always distinct, not necessarily as always the same. Something that's different from that binary between sameness and difference, and perhaps reintroduces, problematically possibly, an idea of the human, because of course that's a problematic concept, but perhaps a reshaped vision of the human, not in its old humanistic and universalist form, but in a different sort of way, in which, yes, not everything is the same, quite clearly, and there has to be some idea of specificity and singularity, but also not everything is completely different either. I don't know whether that's an adequate.
I'm sure I'm asking a very big question, but in the beginning, part of what I'm getting at is that if the argument is that the concentration camp is not really distinct from, but part of like a bigger picture of modernity.
Its most egregious form. Yes.
Its most egregious form. Then the question is, well, I mean, what if we apply the same kind of logic to the Gulag or the re-education camps during the Cultural Revolution?
Yeah.
Then we'll be saying this is not distinct as part of the Soviet model.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is the logical conclusion that one would draw, that these things are not distinct. In the same way that, for example, Michel Foucault described disciplinary power not only as something that takes place in prisons, but that has to be sought out within modern society in a more general way. Yes, one has to make those links, but they're not always easy links to make, especially when one is talking about the Holocaust. They're easier links to make, I think, if one has defined the tradition of the concentration.
Leve?
Thanks for that. That's fascinating. I have a question about the categories, the concentrationary, especially when the categories and concepts become the ways of describing cultural productions. So you make a distinction between what might be a Holocaust film versus a concentrationary film. And when I was listening to you talk about Rousset and Hannah, I was remembering actually that you and Rousset presented this here at the Hammer.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
When the book was just coming out. And so
Yeah, no,
I was
right.
remembering that was my first sort of exposure to these concepts, and it's something I find really compelling, and that I think I accept almost unquestioningly. But I have to say, when you were showing us the still shots from World of Glory, which looks chilling and compelling and all kinds of things. I'd never heard of the filmmaker. I'm very interested to see the film and to know his work. And this isn't so much a thought, but a kind of hypothetical about the stakes of this. I take your argument about it being a concentrationary film and not a Holocaust film, but I wonder about the sort of interpretive gains and losses of perhaps not being willing to call it a Holocaust film. or whether you can imagine that there might be something that interpretive gain in calling it a Holocaust film. Even though I understand very well that other than the first image, they're not images taken from the Holocaust per se. But there is that first image that could be said to condition the rest of the film. So I wonder, do we win in a different way? Is there a win in thinking about it as a Holocaust film as opposed to a concentration film?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good question as well. I think that if the games, I hope that I was attempting to spell out what the games are, and especially around that those connections between the normal and the extreme, and the everyday and extreme violence, which, if we're to interpret it as a Holocaust film, especially using the categories that I was talking about before, as what often describe what we mean when we're talking about Holocaust art, I think we lose sight of. So I suppose what I'm trying to do is suggest that there are certain losses if one reads it. It's a dangerous thing to do, because of course the images, those stills that I showed you at the beginning, are quite clearly a reference to what we know as the precursor to extermination, to mass extermination. So, and obviously tied up with a Holocaust historiography. So it is dangerous. It's a bit. It seems counterintuitive to actually suggest that this isn't really about the Holocaust. And I'm doing the same sort of thing with Zygmunt Bauman, because he was, in his own mind, he was talking about the Holocaust. But in the same way that with both this cultural product and his sociological analysis, I think that there are more losses to actually linking it with the Holocaust, because one loses sight of this different but overlapping tradition.
Oh, sorry. If you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
I'm kind of an outlier here. Just to contextualize my question. I'm from a background in both history and religious studies. It's more a hermeneutical question, so forgive me if this is something you just want to dismiss out of hand. That's fine. When I was doing my master's a few years ago, I had an instructor who was talking about this notion of two events marking the beginning of the postmodern age. One of them was the horrors of the Holocaust, and the parallel to that was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And I guess my question here would be, with regard to someone like Bauman, because in this theory of who we're addressing things like Holocaust theology and things like that, notions of, say, God's relationship to man, and a number of things like that. But if you said this isn't saying that the Holocaust is the outcome of modernity, but certainly it would not have taken place without those mechanisms. What do you think someone like Bauman might say that this is, perhaps in some way, these events, the Holocaust, the atomic bombs, are perhaps the worst possible outcomes of modern mechanism? Does this then usher in a postmodern age, and what would be the implications of that? How do you think you might react?
I think he'd agree. I think he certainly would agree in terms, because he actually says in the book that this is the most egregious form of violence that actually takes place elsewhere. So they're not typical. They're not typical, but nevertheless, they come out of those processes if we're to understand where they come from, rather than with God or some other inexplicable phenomenon, then they have to be seen within certain non-developments, but in their most egregious form. So yes, absolutely. And in terms of the other part of your question, in terms of do events like the Holocaust and the bombing of Hiroshima mean that one has a different conception about modernity that leads certain theorists to ideas of post-modernity, even if it's one that liquid modernity, but one's moved into a different phase of modernity. Yes, absolutely too. But of course, Bauman wouldn't be the only person there. He would actually theorize how the effects of those events, or what the effects of those events has been on philosophical, theological, and various other forms of imagining the human and humanity, because of course so many others were asking similar questions. But nevertheless, in his case, yes, and given that so much of his work was about how the garden state is fundamental to understanding the modern thrust, ideas of progress, ideas that permeate throughout society, how those do come to an end because of seeing where they led us to, then yes, they're absolutely fundamental to understand the post-modernity.
Thank you.
Yeah, last question.
Sure, fine. I was surprised at your answer to Michael when you suggested that Bauman might not have read the literature to lead him to the concentrationary thesis. Because I would have expected you to build towards the conclusion that Bauman was allergic to this idea in some intellectual, methodological, or building up a fine political sense.
No, not at all. No, I think that had it been mentioned to him, I think I would hope that he would have seen the affinities with what he's talking about. So I don't think there would have been. I don't think he would have had. He would have been able to see what the. I just don't know. I'm not sure whether he read, say, David says, The Concentrational Universe. I don't know whether he ever quotes from it, but I might be wrong because I can't remember all of his quotes. But I don't think that it would have been something that would have shocked him. I think that he would have well seen because he was so well versed in forms of in postmodern, in post-war French Marxist theory, and how it developed in a Gramscian way around ideology. That I don't think this wouldn't have been anything different to really what he would have thought himself.
Well, thank you so much. I think there's more to discuss. I know I look forward to discussing this more with you, but I think we're at time, so I want to thank the audience for joining us, and thank you once again for a wonderful lecture.